and welcome to BB 404 Business of Craft Brewing. My name is Maria Pearman and I'm a CPA and the instructor of the accounting and finance section of this course. I own a business called Radix Accounting, and our accounting firm specializes in working with craft beverage manufacturers in the alcohol space. So we have brewers, distillers, craft cider makers as well. And today we're going to be talking about sources of capital. This is the first main section of your course in accounting and finance. For sources of capital, what that means is how are you going to finance your business? Starting a brewery, and I'll use that term interchangeably with if I'm talking about a brewery or a distillery or a cidery. But when you start a business like that, it is incredibly capital intensive, which means it takes a lot of money to get off the ground. The equipment is expensive, the space is expensive, it takes a lot of personnel, possibly, depending on what you're doing. Then if you're having a restaurant involved, that's another area where it takes a lot of funds to get it off the ground. So we're going to talk about how to do that today. And usually with financing an enterprise like this, it comes from two areas: debt or equity. Debt is when you borrow money from a bank or other third parties, and equity is when the owners of the business put forth money and use that to start up the business. So in terms of sources of capital, there are lots of different areas this debt or equity can come from. It can come from self-funding, which means that you're taking the funds out of your own pocket. You can go friends and family, which is a common avenue for a lot of startups to go down. Other investors, so maybe it's other people who you may know but aren't necessarily friends or family, or it could be complete strangers as well. Institutional financing means that that money is coming from a bank usually, or some other third-party business. State or municipal development funds. A lot of times you'll hear talk about SBA lending, Small Business Association lending, and those are funds that the government sets aside for businesses, for development of an economic activity. Government grant programs, that's also sort of along the same lines of state and municipal development funds. It's just a slightly different focus. With grants, there may be a specific purpose for the grants. Angel investors. So angel investors are wealthy individuals who are investors, and they see your business as a target opportunity, as an opportunity for investment for them. Usually it's at a smaller dollar amount, and then when you get into a higher dollar amount, you talk about venture capital sources. So venture capital is different than angel investors because angel investors primarily are individuals or small groups of people, whereas venture capital is institutions or funds, a larger group of people. And then also crowdfunding. And crowdfunding is something that has just come into being in the last 10 years. GoFundMe, Circle Up, Kickstarter. These are all different variations of crowdfunding. And in essence, what you do in crowdfunding is you put together a platform, or you put together a pitch that goes out to people at large on the internet, and it's usually a video that describes your business and what you're going to be doing, and then you ask for donations. And if people fund you, you have a cap. Say let's say you want to raise $25,000 in crowdfunding. So you have a prescribed amount of time to raise your goal of funding, and if so, you get all the money, and if you don't reach that watermark, then you get none of it. So it's an interesting way to raise money these days. It's a little riskier because you could go through the effort to create a video and put it out there, and then at the end of the day, maybe you don't reach your goal and you get none of it. But great opportunity to reach a larger crowd of people. Other opportunities for sources of capital is trade credit, and what that means is that you are on credit terms with vendors, or you're using credit cards. Equipment leasing, so if you need to buy a bunch of tanks, there are manufacturers who will do equipment leasing, which means that instead of actually buying that equipment, you lease it instead, or maybe it's a lease to own situation. And mug clubs, this is pretty popular in the brewing industry. In a mug club, it's usually set up for individuals who are backing a new brewery right from the beginning, and they give a nominal amount of money They keep a mug at an establishment, and different mug clubs work in different ways, but usually it's going to be a situation where you walk in, you're able to grab your mug from its slot at the bar. It's always available, and then you get a beer with that. Either the beer is complimentary, or you pay a reduced price, or maybe you pay regular price, but you've always got your mug there. And it's also a great way to build brand equity with individuals who are some of your first investors. So, as I mentioned, that investment structure, it's going to be debt or equity, or it could be a hybrid of the two. So again, debt is when you borrow money from someone else and then pay it back. And equity is when investors and owners contribute money into the company with the idea that they'll get it back at some point in the future. Usually for most businesses, there's a payday on the horizon. So you're setting up your business with the idea that you will have an exit sometime in the future. And that runway is, it can be, pretty short, or it can be a long-term exit strategy depending on the owner and the direction that the owner wants to take the business. But with debt, what that looks like is you borrow money and pay it back with interest. So the person who loans you money gets back not only what they loaned you, but also the interest income as well. So that's how a lender would make money in that situation. Equity, you're building equity, you're putting it into the company, and the idea is eventually you'll make back your money when you exit the company. Some businesses are using a debt and equity hybrid. Oftentimes I see this with breweries when they are going out to investors, and they'll say, hey, investor, I'm going to give you 1% of my company for X amount of dollars, but you also have to give me that same amount of money as debt. So let's say the number was $10,000 to buy 1% of a company. So you go to the investor and say, here's an opportunity to buy into my company, 1%, $10,000, but you're not going to get that 1% unless you also agree to loan me an additional $10,000 at an interest rate of Y, whatever that will be. But that way you have an opportunity to get twice as much money for one amount of equity. Now you do have the debt portion as well, but it can be a really nice strategic angle to play if you are not keen on giving up a portion of your company. So who should invest? Well, that depends on the situation. Friends and family, they are always going to be probably the most sympathetic to your cause and the ones who want to get behind it the most, and quite often the easiest people to get involved in as investors. Word of caution, always getting friends and family involved in business can sometimes be hairy because you never know what the future is going to bring, but they are more often than not the first people who are approached about being investors. Other people with whom you have a pre-existing relationship, so a substantive pre-existing relationship. This could be another business associate or a close relationship where you've done business in the past. So the two individuals or two entities know each other and understand kind of what they're getting into working with one another. There could be accredited and sophisticated investors. Now those terms, accredited and sophisticated investors, those are terms that are quite often used in a legal environment when you're talking about types of people who can invest. So for example, accredited means you have to have $1 million net worth, and the term sophisticated just simply means that an individual knows enough about business and investing that he or she is aware of all the risks that are associated with the investment. So you'll frequently see that type of language introduced into legal documents and prospectus for businesses. A prospectus is basically your preview, your forecast of what you expect a business to do over the first couple years of its life. And also those individuals who have financial wherewithal and business sophistication. So same type of idea that we're conveying in the third bullet point with accredited and sophisticated. So who should invest? Those are people who A, have the money to do it, and B, have enough business sense and business knowledge to understand what they're getting into. No investment is bulletproof. No investment is without its risk. And it's important that the people that you get involved in your business, if you're going after investors, are aware of what they're getting into. So, How do you approach investors? Well, there are securities regulations that you have to comply with, and these are legal guidelines. There are lots of do's and don'ts associated with the securities regulations. And I will give you the caveat here that you definitely should get engaged with a knowledgeable attorney before going down the path of approaching investors. Getting legal advice is expensive, but it is absolutely worth it. Without that legal advice, you can get yourself into hot water pretty quickly. And also, it is incredibly important to get legal advice from someone who has done this before in the environment of a brewery or, cidery, distillery, whatever you're going after, because the alcohol aspect of the industry brings into play a lot of different regulations that are unique to this environment. So some of the do's and don'ts of securities regulations. Avoid advertising and general solicitation. There are lots of fine rules around how you can advertise a prospective brewery or a prospective business that has yet to open. You cannot mention the investment in media, no social media references as well. Avoid presenting to large groups about these terms. You can't use mass mailings, and you must keep good records of your solicitations. So all this has to do with securities regulations, and it's important to follow the rules around it because the securities regulations reinforce that you need to be approaching people who are knowledgeable and sophisticated investors when presenting prospectus. It's important to develop an investor packet. If you're going to go out and talk to people, especially if you're going away from the friends and family route and you're talking to either business associates or other third parties, it's important to develop this investor packet. It should include a business plan, and it doesn't have to be overblown, but you do need to put into plain English what your business vision is and how you plan to achieve it, what your differentiator is, and some basic guardrails around what you're building. A term sheet. So a term sheet is the nuts and bolts of the deal. I'll give you an example. A term sheet for a debt and equity hybrid situation might include something like you provide X number of dollars and that gives you access to X% of the company in equity. And also you give us Y number of dollars and that's going to be a debt instrument that will pay back to you over so many years at a defined interest rate. So the term sheet really lines out in clear detail what the investor could expect. Pro forma financials is critical. So any investor is going to be interested in the money piece of your operation. And pro forma financials are projected financials. That's another way to think about the term pro forma. So pro forma financials should include a balance sheet and an income statement, possibly a statement of cash flow. And those three financial forms are critical to a complete set of financials. We're going to be talking about those much more in depth throughout this course. But the pro forma financials are important because that gives investors an idea of, when are you going to break even? What is the cash situation? And the idea that's on everybody's mind is, when am I going to get paid back? The operating agreement is the legal document that governs how the organization is structured. These are the rules of the game for your organization. And it's important to present that to investors so that they understand what the agreement is, what their rights are, what happens in the event of a disagreement, what happens if they want to get out of the company. So a lot of important topics are covered in the operating agreement. And again, that is something where you do need to seek good legal counsel, seek legal counsel from someone who is experienced in the beverage realm. Operating agreements are really interesting because, especially if you are engaged to be set up as a partnership, an operating agreement can be as flexible as anything under the sun. You can do anything in that operating agreement. It's really flexible, which is great because it allows a business owner, like let's say that you are a brewer and you want to start your own brewery. You don't have the financial wherewithal to do it on your own, so you're going to admit in a bunch of other people because you need access to that capital. Well, if you define your operating agreement smartly, it will give you the opportunity to run the show and make decisions on all the critical elements of the business, and it can limit the say that your other investors have. So something to think about, especially as you start to craft something to present to outside investors. How much input and how much do you want other people to have a say in your operations? The subscription or admission agreement, this is the difference in the terminology, has to do with whether you're a corporation or a partnership. So basically, this is the agreement that officially lets in other people into the entity. And a private placement memorandum, which is another legal document about placement in the company. So all of those elements are important to present as a full investor packet. It gives investors not only an opportunity to see what the future might look like for them, it also demonstrates that you've really thought out this whole idea pretty in depth. And if you've done all these steps, you will be so ready for what's coming, because you're going to have to think about developing an operating agreement that works under a variety of situations. With the pro forma financials, you will have thought about what the financial future is going to look like down the road and whether or not this is truly feasible and how much money it's going to take to do it. So, managing investor expectations, this is one of the finer points of developing a company. So, quite often in my experience, I see situations where partnerships are begun and other people come into the partnership as an investor, and they think, oh man, I'm investing in a brewery and I'm going to get, lots of money every year. The brewery's doing well and I'm going to get a payback right from the get-go. So, how to manage those investor expectations is critical, particularly around when and how they can expect to get their money back. So, best practices for communication. Number one, hold an annual investor meeting. And ideally, this is something where people will attend in person. Usually, it's going to be a business update by the owner or the primary partner, the operating partner. There's a financial component where you review the financials for the year. You talk about plans coming up for the future. You talk about challenges that have happened in the prior year. Quite often, the CPA and or attorney are in attendance to answer any questions. Aside from that annual investor meeting and it being a vehicle to communicate important updates, it's also a really great opportunity to solidify the relationship with investors, to keep investors engaged in your company. Another good communication piece is the quarterly investor updates. Usually these are just emailed or mailed updates, and it's a business update that the owner will put together to provide the same content that is given at the annual investor meetings, but it's just a little more condensed as over a shorter period of time. And the big elephant in the room, investor distributions. When am I going to get my money? That is the question on the investor's mind quite frequently. So how do you answer that question? One of the things that is really important to do is define parameters that help you calculate how much money is distributed and when. And I would recommend putting that in the operating agreement. So just having these guidelines is important because it becomes your guardrails. So think about this. Perhaps you say distributions will be given in a period where there is netcom of X percent, and there is sufficient money in the bank to cover 3 months of operating expenses, as well as any capital expenses that we foresee in the next 12 months. So that gives you your guardrails. You say, okay, as long as we've met our net income percentage of whatever it may be, let's say it's 10%. So if our net income is 10% for the year, and in the bank we've got enough money to cover basic operating expenses for 3 months, and to cover any of those big capital expenditures, and capital expenditures means buying equipment or expansion needs over the next 12 months. If all of that is covered and we still have cash left over, we'll give out money to investors. That's one example. And then also document the policy. So as I mentioned, it's important to have that down in writing, but maintain flexibility. So it's nice, again, with operating agreements, it can be pretty flexible. Give yourself guardrails, but not something that's so definitive that you don't have leeway with it. And most importantly is communication. This goes not only for managing the investor expectations, but for everybody who is involved in your business. It goes for your managers, your line employees, the professional services who surround you, your attorney and your CPA. Communication is critical because it helps alleviate a lot of those pain points before they really become problematic. So those are some ideas about the best practices for sources of capital. My name is Maria Pearman, and I'm the instructor for this course. I'll see you again here next week. If you have any questions in the meantime, please reach out to me. I'll be happy to answer any questions along the way. We'll be seeing you in a live session soon.